MeMonster.
Chapter 221. Princess Yarina said that the road she was going to take would be a hard road, but in fact, both Araceli and I had never once thought that this trip would be hard. The monsters which appeared along our way were all so weak that they could be easily dealt with simple firearms, and when a third-rate villain, namely bandits, comes stopping you out of nowhere, you can just beat them up to relieve some stress. Compared to the battlefield where I had to keep my eyes open all night long, this trip was nothing but a healing trip. However, for Yarina, this trip wasn't healing at all. After all, even though the monsters and the villains did not threaten their lives, the stress was getting to her since the place they were traveling right now was the other side of the empire which she had never known while living as a princess. For her, this place was hell itself. She was experiencing firsthand the horrors which couldn't be explained by common sense. It left her wondering just how in the world this huge empire was still standing even after 500 years. It seems like the reason the empire is still standing is because of the protagonist correction. Protagonist correction was a mysterious and unique power. It could make whatever the protagonist sees as correct or ideal into something where the laws of physics or common sense did not work at all. Just like the protagonist from a few worlds prior whose skill was related to common sense, quite a number of the protagonists were using these common sense-based abilities, especially in the case of this world where all people and nobles trained their muscles and took everything with strength. Such a subtle change in the world made the hero, Ivan, stand out even more amongst the crowd with his ability to have the best muscle training method in the world. However, in this case, the situation was very different from that hero protagonist from another world. At that time, the common sense of the world changed simply by instilling real common sense into the protagonist, but this world was moving with common sense that really exists. Even if the abnormal muscle love was not caused by the protagonist, it was a setting which their ancestors have changed from 500 years ago, so killing one main character would not completely remove this setting. If the protagonist dies, probably the side effects of excessively trained one's muscles will be exposed to the whole world, and the empire will be destroyed. But if Yarina had proper common sense and became an empress. Now let's return to the imperial palace. I understand. Without any such side effects, the world would be restored to its original state. Originally, the Empress of Primelia would invite all the scholars with the best knowledge and virtue into the castle. Wise men hiding in the forest were brought into the castle to teach. Wise wizards and mathematicians were also invited to teach, but the current Primelia no longer invites such scholars. Those who were braver and had stronger muscles were those who qualified as scholars. That's why to gain that common knowledge, Yarina had no choice but to use the old and rusty library located in the corner of the imperial palace. She didn't even have anyone to tend her aside from Saren, so on her very first day after returning to the castle, she had to spend all day mopping and dusting off cobwebs and organizing the books in the library. Even after doing that, since the library had been abandoned for a very long time, some books were unreadable. But it's okay, with this much I can study enough. Autumn shook his head in admiration as he heard Yarina say so while opening the first page of a moldy book. Korean alphabets 500 years ago were those from the Joseon dynasty. If you ask modern people to read the letters from 500 years ago, would they be able to read them? The answer is, it's impossible. Unless they were a linguist, that feat was something unattainable. But since Yarina was diligent and had read numerous books from old times and interpreted the alphabet one by one, she had become a linguist herself. She's really amazing, Autumn complimented her in his mind. From Autumn's perspective, he who had given up his studies at an early age, this part of Yarina was even more admirable than the fact that she trained her muscles even when she knew she was not talented. But what are you doing? Autumn said as he moved his gaze towards Araceli, who was turning the page of a book with a twinkling eye. Yes, there are a lot of interesting strategy books here. The language system of another world is also interesting. It's good to know a lot about things, right? Is that so? Unlike ordinary people who memorize the knowledge they deemed as important, Araceli, who had far transcended the human realm, stores all the knowledge she had come across in her head. Therefore, she always had the thirst to know more, and because of that, she would always read any books she could find anywhere, anytime. Therefore, when she came into a library where the traditions and history of this world were sleeping, she couldn't stand still. I am going to accelerate time from now on. It'll be fine, Professor, please go on without me. Hi. Araceli, who had always been with Autumn, for once refused to spend time with him after falling in love with the books, which came as quite a shock to him. At that moment, a feeling that his daughter, who had always followed him, had finally reached puberty and had turned cold assaulted Autumn. Although he did not have a daughter at the moment, he was able to understand the heart of a father who had a daughter. Am I going alone? Yes. Am I really going alone? Yes, I will be fine. UC Autumn, who was going to say that it was him who was not okay with it, finally began to fast forward the time after keeping the words from leaking out from his mouth. The remaining time was 1 year. The battle for the throne was just around the corner. It was said that the peculiar system of succession battle originated from 500 years ago, when the muscle began to dominate the empire. At that time, the crown prince was weaker than the first princess and had a weaker willpower. Therefore, the empress at that time was displeased with the fact that he was the one who would inherit the throne. For that reason, from that day on, the names crown princess and crown prince were no longer used. All children of the empress were called princes and princesses equally. It was because no one dared to take over the position of the emperor without training their muscles. Your Majesty, all 3 princesses have gathered for the succession battle. Is that so? The succession battle was nothing less than a national project and a national festival. Visitors from other countries were allowed to spectate. Even people who were not nobles could spectate it. The city of Ferodal's Dome was built exclusively for this event. It was a crowded city full of merchants who gathered for business all year round, and it was also a place for merchants to get an opportunity to somehow attach themselves to the nobles who had territories. Looking at the dome whose roof stretched high into the sky, Empress Primalia looked at the 6 people kneeling in front of her. The first princess and the war hero. The second princess and the hero. The third princess and the woodcutter. The empress' gaze was particularly directed towards the woodcutter, but no one noticed it as all the nobles just gossiped when they saw the empress. Your Majesty seems to have lost some muscle, doesn't it? Recently, there have been rumors that she has been training her muscles less and less. It must be nonsense. But doesn't she look like she'd lost a lot of muscle? She's much thinner than last year. Now, I think I can win against her with my strength. You check it. The whispers of the nobles could be heard in UC Autumn's sensitive ears. He glanced up and looked at the empress, and obviously she had lost more muscle than the last time he met her 2 years ago. And however, he couldn't think about it much longer. Now from this moment on, no nobles nor peoples, knights nor soldiers can ever help the princesses. If the princess dies on the battlefield, the people need not feel sorry for them. It happened because the princess was weak. The crowd erupted in applause at the empress' heavy cry. It's a mess. UC Autumn was confused for a second, thinking whether this was the Olympics or the succession battle. I will start the first trial to test their fighting power, breaking through the difficulties right now. When those words fell, all 3 princesses stood up and looked at their guardians. They have trusted and depended on their guardian all their life, but from now on they would not be able to receive any help. UC Autumn looked at Irina with new eyes. When he first met her, it was probably because she was a 14-year-old girl who couldn't eat well. She was short and skinny. But the current Irina had transformed splendidly. She was now over 170 cm tall, and healthy muscle could be seen all over her body, yet she still retained the curve a woman had. If she starts modeling for an advertisement on Earth, UC Autumn bet that she could easily rival Helene. Have you studied well? Of course, she smiled brightly, revealing her white teeth. Seeing that smile, UC Autumn felt reassured. Glancing at her side, he saw the second princess, Karina Fridelia, the heroine of the world, and the hero Ivan, speaking with a serious expression on their faces. Pot eavesdrop. The Donctomat and allied powers have prepared a mighty magic. Can you win against it? Don't worry, princess. With this muscle, I can break anything, let alone magic. The princess only needs to be concerned about the succession battle. After hearing their exchange, UC Autumn guessed. Perhaps in terms of the main story, the topic they just talked about would be the red thread of part 2 of the story. If the content of part 1 was Ivan, the hero who finally conquered the empire with one muscle, along with the second princess, Karina, shock a powerful magic attack, however, a sufficiently trained muscle destroys magic would be the content of the second part. After all, if from the beginning the same content was repeated over and over again, people would inevitably get tired of it. Perhaps the end of this world was when hardened muscles destroy even a great magic and the empire unify the whole world. UC Autumn had never written a novel, but it was easy to predict what would happen next because he had encountered so many clichés. The current empire had conquered 50% of this world, but to think it will be 100% conquest, it's truly terrifying to even imagine that. Go and crush them all, UC Autumn said towards Irina. Fufu, it is forbidden to duel with each other until one princess is eliminated. Is that so? Yeah. It was something Yarina had explained to him before, but well, Autumn didn't really pay any attention to it. It was an offending act, however, for Yarina. She was okay with it. After all, she preferred the uncaring yet caring Autumn. Then I will come back with a wind. Currently, Yarina has already gained 5 circles in magic. However, she still could not let her guard down as the body specifications of the other princesses were also at the top level of the rank. Although Arakeli had bestowed her with a strategy to bring down a fighting warrior who believed in only one superpower, she couldn't rely on it completely. This is the beginning. As the 3 princesses walked towards the dome of Ferodal with heavy gait, everyone was silent. Someone swallowed their saliva. That was because it was a battle between 2 princesses with the greatest body specs of all time, unprecedented in 500 years of history of the Empire. The battle of the princesses who easily passed 7,000 kg in 3 exercises before they turned 30. How fierce would it be? The 3rd princess, on the other hand, still looked sloppy and had little muscle, so she was merely an object of criticism. Well, she's indeed pretty. Yeah. Or that was how it should be. However, the 3rd princess, Yarina, who came back after 5 years, had turned into a very splendid figure. The timid youngest princess had disappeared. She was walking shoulder to shoulder with her 2 older sisters with her sharp, dignified steps. The confidence that flowed out of her eyes was enough to make the words of those who tried to criticize her swallow their words back. However, amongst the countless pairs of eyes who looked at her, there was only one who could truly see her. It was Empress Primelia, who knew the true identity of the spirit exuded by Yarina. Yarina Fridelia is 1 step away from awakening the skill Emperor Spirit SSS rank. Watching the spectacle, the system who had been silent throughout the journey felt befuddled. It was because the probability was slowly shifting. Towards Yarina, no. It was towards Autumn. It was a very small amount, but it was clear that it was flowing in. Autumn had used a lot of probability in order to exhaust it, and he had never done anything that would make him the protagonist. But why was it that the probability was still flowing towards Autumn? Her stomach started to burn more and more due to this unanswered question. Chapter 222. The first part of the trial in the succession battle was overcoming obstacles. It was a trial which tested how the participant could overcome various trials, crises, and traps when they appeared. In the past, the participants always had numerous ways to overcome the obstacles. However, nowadays, of course, all of the obstacles were being overcome through pure muscle and will, destroying, smashing, bracing, and thoroughly dismantling. Even if in the end the participants were covered in blood, the warriors who eventually arrived at the finish line were the best of the best. Pug. When the violent cheers erupted from the stadium, the 3 princesses set off. Thousands of people had come to see the princess who would soon become the empress. They sat around the dome of Ferodal with their hands sweaty due to sheer excitement. The 3 princesses couldn't interfere with each other during the trial. On top of it, they wouldn't know how far their competitor had progressed until they arrived at the finish line. Only the people watching the game could know the progress of all the princesses. Their start was flashy. They leaped forward in the air and rushed towards the trial. Of course, Yarina was the only one who didn't do that. Oh. What a forward leap. The first hurdle of the trial was crossing a rocky mountain terrain. The princesses had to climb over or break through it to clear it. But the problem was, the rocky mountain was too high to climb over. The weak but strong-willed princess would normally climb through to pass it, and the strong one would smash the mountain of rocks. As the first and second princesses swung their fists, a light storm broke out and a hole started to drill itself in the rocky mountain. Meanwhile, the 3rd princess had not even arrived yet. She was slow to the point that the few people who had some expectations from her were instantly disappointed. Obviously, the 2nd princess is much more powerful. The 1st princess seems to have realized that her strength is less than the 2nd princess, and it seems like she has been polishing her techniques more. The speed at which the 2 of them broke rocks was unbelievable. Then, when the 2 princesses were about to finally break the last rock, the 3rd princess arrived at the front of the rocky mountain. The spectator clicked their tongue as they watched her walking leisurely, not even running or sweating. Has she given up on her life? Well, she doesn't even have enough vassals to become an empress. Yet she didn't even want to challenge herself. However, the people who had been chatting were astonished when the third princess raised a wand. Wand, maybe it's magic. How you see all sorts of absurd sights in life. Finally, the third princess has turned crazy. At that moment, the third princess gracefully waved her wand and chanted, Lapusman fight. It was a type of high-level magic which channeled the caster's will towards the rock. What just happened? What the third princess just did was vastly different from the other princesses who were loudly breaking the rocks. Since the rocks were making way for her, all she had to do was walk leisurely through the created passage. When she passed the rocky mountain without any effort, the other two princesses who had a head start were also finally able to pass through the rocky mountain. Unlike the other two princesses whose muscles had already turned red, Yarina was still walking gracefully. No beads of sweat could be found on her beautiful face. The next obstacles which stood in the way of the princesses also had a similar pattern to the rocky mountain. It was blazing fire. To get through it, they would need strong muscles as well as mental strength to overcome the pain. While the two princesses were sprinting forward even when their whole body was charred by fire, Yarina gracefully waved her wand. Flamita. Moments later, the blazing fire miraculously split sideways. It was as if a red carpet had been laid for just one person. With magic, something like that can happen. Of course not. The reason why Yarina could do it was because the magic she was currently using was an extremely high-level magic. It required its caster to not only cast a simple offensive or defensive magic, but to also understand and deal with the nature of the element itself. With only a few years left for the succession battle to take place, Yarina was determined to learn these high-level magic spells, and what just happened proved that she was able to master them completely. It's great. Slowly, Yarina began to take the lead from the other princesses. It was indeed nice to see them somehow break through the obstacles with their guts and strength alone, but in the end, Yarina's method was much faster. When she encountered a bridge made of lava, she gently swung her staff to create a bridge of rock and walk over it. And when she arrived at a cliff with nothing leading to the land across, Yarina summoned a flock of luminous birds in front of her and used them as a foothold. Watching her progress steadily, the audience was dead silent. For 500 years, the perception that muscle was the best had been taken for granted by all people and nobles. With muscles, tenacity, blood and sweaty passion, and brute strength, they thought that it would be enough to overcome any difficulties. But right now, they were attracted by the third princess magic rather than the first or second princess strength. It was because it was more elegant, more relaxed, more beautiful, more mysterious and classy. How could they not feel so when such beautiful magic was beating the two strongest warriors of the continent, even though the caster was doing so only by shaking the staff a little? No, these are nothing but puny tricks. Yes, that's right, there is a golem as the last trial before the finish line. Can she even defeat the golem with magic? When Autumn heard about the golem, he smirked. It's not like he thought that Yarina would win unconditionally. Rather, he was surprised that there was such a high-tech golem here in this world. In a world where everything is ruled by muscles, it's good to see they still use some magical elements in the succession battle. After all, without magic and science, the world would be nothing. It's just that magic wasn't being described in detail in this world's story, but it still managed to constantly reveal its presence behind the muscles. Boom, boom. When the three princesses finally arrived at the final gate, the crowd clenched their fists. A part of them was hoping that either one of the first two princesses would win, and the part that wanted a change in the empire wanted the third princess to win. The first princess rushed in with a roar as loud as the roar of the golem. Moments later, the first princess' arms had already clashed against the golem's arms. The height of the golem easily surpassed 5 m, but her strength even managed to push this golem backwards. But something even more surprising happened on the other side. The second princess had ripped off the golem's hand with her grip forcefully. Even though the golem had 3 pairs of arms, it was surprising that she could rip one off so easily. As expected, there is nothing in this world that can't be beaten by muscles. Continue to smash it, princess. Meanwhile, the third princess, the first to arrive at the final gate, still hadn't taken any action. She just stood there taking her sweet time. Some said her taking the lead was nothing but a trick. Now that she has reached here, I think she is afraid that her insignificant fighting power will be exposed. Why did she have to wait for the other two princesses? Everyone who saw her wondered so. But her next actions made the spectators think that she wanted to do so to show the overwhelming difference between her and the other princesses. As she graciously moved her wand, a fluorescent rope materialized around the golem's body and bound it tightly. Then the golem knelt down on its knees. Lux Klumne. Pillars of light rose from the ground and smashed the golem's head. The golem was destroyed after only 3 magic spells were casted. Unable to accept that reality, everyone gasped in disbelief. She's smart. Right. However, the truth was, third Princess Yarina didn't do it to show overwhelming dominance. She had to meditate once she found out the opponent was a golem and had to think on what type of spell to cast, but no one knew that she was preparing for such magic. Eventually, the second princess succeeded in destroying the golem. When all the obstacles were finished, the veil blocking each other would be lifted, and they would be able to see how far the other princesses had progressed. Naturally, the second princess, who thought she would be first one to finish the trial, leisurely trampled on the golem's head with her bloody body and lifted her head up. To her surprise, she made eye contact with Yarina, who, after killing the golem before her, was sitting elegantly with her legs crossed on a pile of golem wreckage while enjoying a cup of coffee. You are late, big sister. You would how? Maybe I was stronger and faster than you. Before long, the first princess also successfully took down the golem, and when the veil was lifted, she really didn't say anything. Unlike the first and second princes who were covered in blood and bruises, the third princess was clean and perfectly fine. Apart from the fact that her breathing was a little ragged, she looked elegant and sharp just like before she had started. It was almost as if she had just gone out for a walk. Of course, the truth was she had almost run out of mana, so she only looked a little different on the outside. And well-trained muscles weren't as good as I thought. Yarina smiled brightly, but her words only provoked the two princesses. Your Majesty, we can't let it continue. Your Majesty, we must immediately execute the third princess who used magic in the succession battle. To mock the sacred succession battle with magic, not muscles. The Empress looked closely at the faces of the numerous nobles who rushed at her as soon as the first trial was over. Those nobles who were questioning the third princess' use of magic were the ones who either supported the first princess or the second princess. If the first and second princesses were defeated, they would lose everything immediately. It was no wonder they were so desperate. They are weak. But in the eyes of the Empress, they only looked pathetic. It couldn't be more lamentable that in this empire there were still nobles who lacked muscles and will. I will ask you, have I ever banned the use of magic in the succession battle? You have not, however. However, what the succession battle is a good place to do anything to prove your strength. Is it unfair because the magic is stronger? Do you think so? That's right. Why is she using magic at a place where you have to prove your strength with muscles? That's funny. Empress Primelia cut off the nobles. She had no more interest in hearing their ramblings. Since when have we, people who trained our muscles, began trembling at the sight of magic? Are you ignoring our national power? Are we that weak to the point we forbid it? The reason we pursue muscle, isn't it for the sake of strength? Are you afraid of strong magic? Then train your muscles even more. If that doesn't work, I'd say learn magic like the third princess in order to become stronger. Magic was no longer a discipline that could be ignored. When it's sufficiently trained, magic could reach a level that even surpassed the power of muscle. The Empress finally had to admit that fact. You know, the combat power of all the trials were extremely fair. The reason why the first and second princesses lost is simple. It was because they are weaker than the third princess. The Empress slammed her fist on the chair's armrest and stood up. If it had been the same as before, the ground beneath the chair would have collapsed, but for some reason her slam only made some cracks on the chair. The succession battle for the throne is a very sacred ceremony, and it is also a place to prove your qualifications to become emperor. You guys dare to object? The results of the battle, guards lock them all in anti-muscle prison. The nobles turned pale at those words. Please, your majesty, that's not what we meant. Please withdraw that order, your majesty. What are you doing? Bring them all out. Anti-muscle prison. This prison was a very terrifying prison with the restriction that you can never train your muscles. While imprisoned in this prison, no protein would be provided and no exercise equipment was allowed. If it is muscle loss, your majesty. In other words, it was the most terrible punishment in this world. In this world where the scale of muscles proved the strength and dignity of a nobleman, losing muscles because you couldn't exercise meant a vertical fall in the position. Sigh, the empress sighed. It was quiet sigh released only after the nobles were taken away by the guards. The empress stroked her chin and thought about the trial which had just concluded. In fact, the victory of the third princess in the succession battle could be considered almost certain just by taking first place in the battle power trial. The virtues of being a true emperor, how it was something which had been completely forgotten 500 years ago. Subjects that no one cared about were now looked at by the empress. The quality of an empress grace etiquette's policy. The empress didn't know anything. After all, she was strong, so she had no need to learn them. However, the princess of this generation was somehow very different from her. A princess who gained strength with her brain and not her muscles. She stroked her biceps, which were slowly fatting away. Recently, when she cut the intensity of her workout by less than half, her muscles didn't grow anymore, and now it was hard to even keep them in their original condition. However, she didn't felt that it was a loss at all. After all, recently, the empress had been interested in reading. Moreover, the books were also related to magic. If the next empress ruled the empire based on magic, not muscle, she thought that maybe it would be a pretty interesting world. Chapter 223. Even though in the first trial Princess Yarina showed an overwhelming display compared to the other princesses, there were still many people who wanted the muscular first and second princess to win the succession battle. The reason was simple: they didn't want magic to win. However, even in the second and third trial, the other princesses could not defeat Yarina. After all, her dignity, manners, charm, and governing knowledge were impeccable. She wasn't just outstanding, she was simply perfect. The reason for the difference between the two princesses and Yarina could be attributed to their goal. While Yarina had a clear goal in mind which reflected her values, the other princesses simply wanted to show off their charms by building their muscles and dream of becoming a muscly ruler. Obviously, it was normal in this world to have such muscular value. A person who has grown their muscles has dignity that is as strong as their muscles. It was also a form of politeness and normalcy for people who had a lot of muscles to be considered attractive or charming. How about Princess Yarina? Though at best, she was only at the level where she could lift 100 kg in the 3 exercises. Such a fragile body could be said as a body with no dignity, charisma, or strength. However, something was different today. Wow, as expected of the second princess, her muscles are so different, it was a graceful choice. That's right. People outwardly cheered for the first and the second. However, at the same time, their gazes couldn't help but secretly be drawn to the third princess. Why do my eyes keep moving towards that weak girl with no muscles? Why does she feel so different today? Even though she had no muscle, it was clear as day that she had charisma, dignity, and charm. The people listened to her every word, every step of her attracted their eyes away, and every single gesture of hers made them bow their heads in front of her. For a reason unknown, a sense of intimidation emanated from Princess Yarina. Supporting actor Karina Fridalia uses front double biceps S-rank skill. Her muscles are temporarily pumped over 1.5 times, giving an overwhelming sense of intimidation. The guardian of the second princess, Hero Ivan, knew a lot of muscle training methods and muscle knowledge that gave the opponent a sense of intimidation. It was a technique which was at least 10 to 100 years ahead from the knowledge of this world. The villain Yarina Fridalia uses Empress Spirit SSS rank skill. In the first place, she was not competing against second princess with her muscles, so the intimidation had absolutely no effect on Yarina, who competed with pure skills. The protagonist has detected a crisis. Guardian Autumn is designated as the villain. However, even after seeing the message, Autumn was still calm. I knew from the beginning that I was going to be the villain. Yu Xiaodam presumed that the first princess must have been the designated rival for the second princess in the development arc, and the third princess Yarina would only appear at the climax of the story, and was probably the second villain character who would finally give the protagonist a sense of crisis. Perhaps the concept of the standoff between Yarina and the second princess was to compete with knowledge, the qualities of a ruler, and oratory skills, a subject which did not have any relation with muscle. However, due to Arakelli's intervention, Yarina had learned magic and gained strength which surpassed muscles. But since the protagonist of this world had poured all his probabilities into muscles, when a crisis arrives, there is only one answer for him: to sort it out with the power of muscle. The flow of the story changes. All three of you are wonderful. It's reassuring to have so many candidates who truly have the qualities for an empress. I can see that the future of the empire is bright and prosperous. However, not everyone can become a ruler just because they have the qualifications of a ruler. I will now start the final test, Empress Primal Primelia said in front of the three kneeling princesses. Princesses, you may have heard of it, but the recent movement of the neighboring allied powers has been unusual. It is said that they have prepared war magic and plan to challenge the empire. They dare challenge us with something like magic. Is the test going to war? I will go ahead and destroy it. Leave it to me, your majesty. The first and the second exclaimed with excitement. Both of them had a strong force backing them, therefore they were confident that they would make a breakthrough even if they went to war right away. But Yarina was different. No noble stood behind Yarina, so she had no power whatsoever. If the test is going to war, I am going to lose. Yarina broke into cold sweat. In the past, there was a history that a princess who made a contribution in war became the empress in the end, so it was not strange to go to war to defend the empire as the last test. If the flow of the story was changed because of the probability, it might have proceeded in such a way. However, the current flow of story was slightly twisted by others' interference, not by Yu Xiaodam, the protagonist or protagonist's correction. Yarina, the empress, mumbled. Her eyes were drawn to Yarina, whom she felt the spirit of empress from. The trial in succession battle must be fair to all candidates, and the empress knew very well how unfair the test would be for Yarina if she gave her a test to play a role in the war. The third princess, who is not supported by either nobles or the people. But what if a very powerful ally, the empress, would take her side? Of course, she has no intention of favoring one princess in the sacred succession battle. If they become an empress without honor, the future of the empire would never be bright. If so, at the very least, she could give a test which would be fair to all the three princesses. No, the last test is a battle. By proving your strength for the last time, I will decide whether or not I can entrust the safety of the empire to you. As the empress' words fell, the three princesses opened their eyes wide. The rules of the match are simple. All three princesses will enter the Ferodal's dome at the same time and fight until one last princess standing. There will be jungle, desert, plains, rivers, and seas inside, so you can use the terrain to defeat the other two princesses. Any questions? When all three princesses were silent, the empress nodded her head with a smirk plastered on her face. Then, let's look forward to the princesses' performances. The final test, both her life and fate were at stake. With cold sweat dripping down her neck, Yarina clenched her fists. I can win. Although royale battles were not unprecedented in the history of succession battle, the people couldn't help but be surprised at the empress' decision, since the princesses of this generation had tremendous strength and charisma, which was very rare even in the long history of the empire. Some people discussed that the seasoned first princess would win, while others said that the strong second princess would eventually win. There was almost no mention of the third princess in the discussion between the people. Let's start the battle. Since the Ferodal's dome was huge and the three princesses started from different positions, they wouldn't meet the other princesses from the start. As soon as the magical voice of the empress echoed, Yarina took a step into the arena. This battle was not only a battle where she risked her life, but also the life of people who had supported her this far. If she lost here, even Yu Xiaodam, who became her guardian, would face death. I can't let that happen. I never want to disappoint the person who believed in me and has supported me for 5 years. The terrain which she departed from was an ordinary forest. It was not that difficult, but she would certainly be exhausted if she moved without thinking. I have to fight strategically. The fact that everyone starts from a different position was clearly meant to add a strategic element. It would be best if the other two princesses could fight each other first, and when one was eliminated, she could attack the other one who would be exhausted by then. But the other two princesses rarely think about strategy. It's because they think that it's only the weak who strategize and look for their opponent's weaknesses. Since the two princesses had come this far just to prove their muscle strength, Yarina thought that they would do the same in this trial. Princess Yarina moved slowly and explored the energy around her with her mana. As she walked through the woods for almost an hour, a wide reed plain appeared. The reeds were too small for the two large princesses to hide. I thought that if they were to fight, they would definitely choose this place. Then the sound of something crashing was heard in the distance. Go! There was no doubt in Yarina's mind that the sound was the result of the two princesses colliding against each other. Are they in the jungle? Yarina hurriedly ran towards the jungle. If the terrain is the jungle. For Yarina, who had weak stamina, the jungle was the worst battlefield as her feet would have to constantly move on the uneven terrain, but she was still fine with it. If two princesses fight ignorantly and then she uses that timing to make a surprise attack, she can win without any problem, however. It's nerve-wracking to fight one-on-one against a warrior. She had asked Arakeli the other day. Miss Arakeli, what should I do if I have no choice but to fight a one-on-one fight with a warrior? Of course, she said with a cute smile, you have to run away. Pardon. A wizard can never defeat a warrior, assuming they are of equal skill. But didn't Guardian Nim defeat Jabarov, the best guardian knight in the Empire, only with magic last time? That's because the professor's level is far higher than that guardian knight, but your situation is different from him, right? In other words, Arakeli was insisting that a wizard must unconditionally avoid a fight with a warrior. Still, there is such a thing as what if, so what if I need to fight a warrior? That Arakeli contemplated, then snapped her finger as if she had a good idea. You should use the professor's method. The guardian's method. Yes, professor's method is. Flinch. Yarina woke up from her reminiscent as she felt something was wrong. The crashing sound felt too regular. Normally, she wouldn't have recognized it, but since her sense was currently better than usual, she sensed it right away. Yarina went down to her knees, placed her hand on the ground, and let her mana run on the floor. Oh, so that's why. Somehow, a laugh leaked out of her mouth as she realized what happened. It was a situation that she could not have imagined in the past, and it was a situation that could be said to be the biggest crisis of her life, but she wondered why she couldn't stop smiling. Two shadows from the front slowly walked towards her. Big sisters, you two seem to be in good shape for someone who just fought fiercely. In other words, the sounds they made was to lure Yarina to the jungle, a battlefield most unfavorable for a wizard with weak stamina. Both of them said nothing. The deep shadows on their face were the only way to know how they felt about the situation. Yes, the two older sisters with a really strong self-esteem had no choice but to face reality and work together with each other, though their strategy wasn't anything fancy since they did something everyone could easily think of. However, their actions came off as very different to Yarina. In the end, both of you opted to identify the weakness of your target and think of a strategy which both of you deemed as nothing but something used by weaklings. Yes. That's why Yarina was happy. Someone might say she's crazy, but she was too happy to the point mana was exploding from her body. She was despised for being weak. It was common for her to hear abusive language for her lack of guts and muscle. However, the two princesses who were considered to be the strongest in the history of the Empire had just joined forces to fight against herself, someone who people considered as nothing but a feeble girl. Yarina, who was quietly resting one of her hands on the ground, slowly straightened her waist and faced the two princesses. She was 170 cm tall, but she was still shorter than her two older sisters who easily exceed 2 m still. At this moment, no one watching this spectacle dared to say that she looked small. Rather, the two princesses felt a huge wall in Yarina, a wall that could never be broken or crossed. They became disgusted with such thoughts, and the princesses inflated their muscles like balloons. Well then, shall we begin, sisters? Chapter 224. The Professor's Fighting Method Number 1. As soon as the 1v2 fight started, Yarina, who shouted as if she wanted to rush towards the other two princesses, suddenly turned around and sprinted with all her might. Never fight in the terrain where the opponent has the advantage. When Yarina trailed back to the way she came, the first and the second princess were bewildered, and so they were late for a split second in chasing her. They couldn't even blame her for her cowardice. After all, it was them who started first. You. However, before the two princesses could run for long, the ground suddenly exploded, and they had no choice but to stop sprinting. The intensity of the explosion itself was weak. However, in the aftermath of the explosion, the fog suddenly descended into the jungle, obscuring their view. Maybe. At that moment, the two princesses realized. Perhaps from the moment Yarina knew that the two princesses held hands and were trying to strike her first, she was already preparing for this magic. Stop calling such useless mist! As the two princesses smashed the floor with their fists, an enormous tornado swept away the mist. But unfortunately for them, Yarina's magic didn't end there. What's happening? The sky suddenly grew dark. The reason was because Yarina used the spell Noctis, which darkens the surrounding in succession. Then, Miss Araceli, are you saying that I should take advantage of the terrain? Yes, but you can't always fight with advantage on your side, can you? In that case, you have to get rid of your enemy's advantage as much as possible. Seeing the two princesses bewildered, Yarina let her voice flow through her mana while trying to be as calm and composed as possible. Sisters, can you blow darkness away with your muscles, or did you train your eyesight with an iron barbell? The field of vision of the two princesses gradually narrowed. They both tried to focus their mana on their sight, but in the first place, the warriors of this world focused on training their muscles rather than magic, so it was simply impossible for them to escape the magic cast by a five-circle magician with their minuscule amount of mana. However, that didn't mean that Yarina had an overwhelming advantage. The radius of the Noctis magic she casted was at most only 50 m. It's unavoidable since she casted in a hurry, which means once they get out of the jungle, the magic would be undone. I have to make sure my sisters notice it as late as possible. Yarina swallowed her saliva. A five-circle magician could store 3 spells beforehand and cast them at will. But the power of that magic would be halved by 30%, and at the same time, she would only be able to cast a spell 1 circle lower than her current level. In case of emergency, she could cast a spell immediately, but its power will not be able to defeat the strength of the princesses. As Yarina moved slowly, she gathered her hands in a diamond shape and tried to cast a spell. But then, the first princess suddenly lifted her head and looked at her. Found you. The first princess took a jagged rock from the ground and threw it with all her might. It broke all the trees on its path and rushed towards Yarina. She hurriedly lowered her body to the floor, but at some point the second princess approached her with her fist tightly clenched. Indeed, eldest sister's senses were much better than second sister's. Second princess' specialty was strength, while the first princess' specialty was skill and sense. Recognizing that, Yarina cast the flame curtain spell she had prepared beforehand in her front. Thanks to that, the second princess' advance was halted as she was forced to guard her body with both arms. However, the magic Yarina just casted was not for attacking purpose, it was to gain momentum. Yarina rode the blast and slid 10 meters back before placing her hands on the ground. Moments later, 7-pronged chains of light rose from the ground beneath her and slithered towards the second princess and tried to bind her. But before the chains could coil around her, the first princess smashed all from her before grabbing the last one with both hands and tried to pull it. Let's see how long you can continue with your tricks. However, Yarina only smirked. Even when she put her hand on the ground, it didn't mean that the chain was connected to her. She snorted and raised her palms slightly. The moment the first princess realized that what she had done was in vain, a shadow cast upon his body. When she looked up, a huge awl was falling from the sky. Because of her muscles, she was the furthest from being agile, so the falling awl was an unavoidable attack for her. Thankfully, she had the second princess on her side. She hurriedly got up, raised her arms, and clamped it when it was right in front of her. Boom! A spider web-like crack started to spread on the awl. However, unlike the awl, only a small wound could be seen on the second princess' skin. Judging by the fact that she just repelled a giant awl, it could be said that she was unharmed. Her agility is amazing after all, Yarina murmured before disappearing again. The professor's fighting method number 2. If you find yourself at a disadvantage because you have a lot of enemies, fight as cowardly and dirtily as possible. Is that so? Yes, do you know that it's annoying to fight an archer or a thief who hides among the bushes while shooting poison arrows while telling Yarina that? Araceli caressed her own chin with her hand, pondered for a moment, and then put her thumb up. But when it is done by a wizard, it's cool. Wait a minute, does that matter? It's very important. Araceli smiled brightly, as if she was just talking about some profound saying or something. After all, in the battle for the throne, showmanship is important. At that moment, the ground split open and thorns protruded from the gap. Meanwhile, a small streak of lightning struck from the sky. Since the two princesses had no knowledge of magic, they could not let go of their tension. However, for someone who knows magic, only one magic could be activated at a time by default. The spells which Yarina was currently using were Terror, a magic that turned the ground upside down and lasts for 5 seconds, and Thunder Paracutin, a lightning strike spell that triggers immediately and lasts quite a while. She only activated both of them at completely different timing to make it seem as if 2 disasters were triggered in succession. In the meantime, Yarina also prepared a spell that only activates when the other person steps on it. The Professor Fighting Method, number 3. To win, you have to do anything you can. Isn't that obvious? No, you have yet to understand the meaning. Even after fighting against Araceli for countless times, she still said that she had yet to understand the meaning to do anything to really win. But now she realized the fight she had right now couldn't be considered a real fight. It was just her harassing her 2 sisters. Because she was only using improvised magic, she couldn't even land a proper blow to her sisters. She just blinded their sight, gave them hot, cold, stinging, painful sensation before running away again to avoid being struck back. Found you. When Yarina was caught up in her own thoughts, goosebumps grew all over her body. She hurriedly raised her head and saw the second princess' viciously contorted face right in front of her. You know what? Among the training methods of Hero Ivan, there is a method to strengthen the eyesight. When the second princess slammed her fist to Yarina's stomach, the sound of balloon popping echoed. Then her body bent like a bow and flung to the distance. But he said I didn't have to train it, so I just kept the knowledge in my head, but now I can finally use it and see through your magic. Yarina staggered and stood up. Her stomach was burning like fire, and her heart was beating really hard as if it was about to explode. When she looked at the second princess, the distance between them was not even 5 m. It was a fatal distance for a wizard who was fighting a warrior. The second princess was also aware of the fact and tried to maintain the distance. Yeah, I never thought that they would keep being a sitting duck anyway. When Yarina glanced at her back, she could see the first princess standing there, blocking her path for running away again. She even stood outside the range of Nocti's magic that darkens the surroundings. However, unbeknownst to her, the moment she escaped the influence of Nocti's spell, the spell which Yarina put down beforehand in the reeds field would be triggered. The wind suddenly blew and the reeds swayed. In the next instance, the reed, which seemed to be dancing, was broken in half. Looking at the sight, the first princess bowed her head to avoid it, since she knew that she could not withstand the magic of her little sister. Meanwhile, Yarina thought she was currently really at a disadvantage. Being flanked by 2 warriors as a wizard was synonymous to being defeated. Then, she recalled one of the conversations she had with Araceli. What if the warriors are stupid and set foot on a field where our spell is prepared? At her question, Araceli just shrugged. A perfectly prepared wizard can never be beaten. Well, as long as the enemy is not a dragon, that's it. The ground began to tremble. However, Yarina did not make any gestures whatsoever. After all, her enemies were people who knew that a certain action was necessary for a wizard to cast their spell. And as she expected, the 2 princesses soon moved. It'll twist your neck. It'll make you unable to use magic ever again. The 2 princesses leaped towards Yarina. However, when the third princess snapped her fingers, 2 pillars rose from the floor and pierced the stomachs of the rushing princesses. In the deltoid and brachialis muscles of the princesses, the veins of them wiggle like snakes. It was a nonsensical superpower which could block pillars that were rushing faster than trains due to magic. But the magic didn't end there. A huge blue line was slowly sparkling in the sky, and before long, the line changed into the shape of a circle. Then heavy rain poured out of nowhere. Yarina laughed as she stroked her wet hair. To manipulate the weather in such a small area, an enormous amount of time as well as a lot of preparation were required. And now, the result of those preparations is unfolding in front of her. Boom, 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 boom. The 2 princesses, who had finally smashed the pillars which obstructed their moves, let out a ragged breath and felt the temperature drop little by little. At the same time, they saw a pure white frost cladding Yarina's hands. On top of it, the ground beneath her was slowly freezing. 4 years have you been wasting your time learning something like this? Yes, that's right. The third princess slowly spread her arms out with the palms of her hands pointing towards the sky. The tiny whirlpool of frost whirling on her palm was clearly proving that her main specialty was ice magic. When the white frost reached the sky, all the raindrops changed into icicles. The small icicles then join up with each other until they become huge icicles and slowly surround the two princesses. Standing in the middle of it, Yarina raised her hands high into the sky. Giant icicles with fluorescent runes engraved on it fell one by one towards the two princesses. They did their best to avoid, but their action was hampered by the ground, which started to freeze even more because of the falling icicles, making it difficult for them to even properly maneuver. Both the princesses shattered the ice while wriggling their thick muscles, pierced through the icicles, or punched hard at the ice growing from the ground, but it was not enough. How does one fight against the cold, which naturally begins to grow after receiving the moisture of nature? It was as if a huge flower of ice had bloomed. Yarina trembled as she walked through the ice flowers. An exhilarating feeling which seemed to make her lose her mind pierced her whole body. At that moment, she felt that her past self, which did not fully understand the words of fighting in a prepared wizard's space, was foolish. Shut up. As she watched the two princesses struggle like worms surrounded by her ice, she woke up to an ecstatic sensation. This is really, I think I'm addicted. Chapter 225. No one dared to open their mouths when the jagged pillars of ice soared high in the sky like a blooming flower of ice. Just like the spectators, the first and second princess were also stunned and couldn't move an inch. Yarina stood alone, surrounded by the ice-blue mist. She looked mesmerizingly beautiful. That gorgeous and dazzling figure was also the victor of the succession battle. Soon, she will be the empress who will rule the empire. Someone yelped a moment later. It was a certain nobleman who had bet his life and his family on the first princess. Just like him, a lot of people on the stand screamed, some were angry, and some simply passed out. These people were those who never thought that the third princess, who had no support and had no gift of building muscle, could ever win the succession battle. I can't admit this. She uses magic. How can we recognize someone who won using magic? Some nobles denied the reality, but it was to no avail. After all, most of the people who saw the succession battle, nobles, knights, coachmen, innkeepers, cardinals and nuns, pharmacists, jesters, wanderers, farmers, hunters, philosophers, craftsmen, the greatest knights of the empire, and even the empress, all of them were overwhelmed by Yarina's presence. Her existence had challenged and started to change the common sense of the people of this world. Before this event, they thought that because the empire was the strongest in the continent, the empress of the empire had to be the strongest in the empire. Therefore, magic, which they assumed to be nothing more than a trick for the weak, would never ever be a match against the strength of muscle and was rejected. Because of that reason, wizards were considered the shame of the family and were often cast away from their own homes. On top of it, wherever they went, they were always stoned and ridiculed. However, in front of them right now, such a wizard was the one still standing after a violent battle. Next to her feet were the two princesses whom the people thought of as the strongest of the empire. The people had to admit, Yarina's frost magic was strong yet beautiful and dignified, worthy of being the power wielded by the empress of this empire. Not only that, the charisma Princess Yarina radiated could also be felt despite all the dirt which covered her entire body. With just slight eye movement and combing her hair behind her neck with her hand, her elegance and her grace flowed out. It was as if she was a woman who was born to be the empress. The people finally realized. All this time, they had forgotten what a true empress was. They started to wonder why they thought that it was only people with strong muscles who were worthy of being the empress. After all, doesn't it mean that an empress with strong muscles could only be good at fighting and lifting barbells? A true empress must be dignified, polite, adept at politics, and possess the dignity of an empress, just like Princess Yarina. Of now, I declare that the succession battle has ended. The Empress' voice echoed. It didn't feel as heavy as in the past, but nevertheless it still carried an authority. Next Empress has been decided. Everyone, prepare yourself for the change that will happen in the Empire. Sometime after Yarina's victory, I was revising my plan of hunting Ivan, the guardian of the second princess as well as the protagonist of this world. If things continue as they are, Ivan would surely die. I wouldn't have to prepare for anything. The rule wherein the princess who has been defeated in the succession battle will be killed alongside her guardian and those who support her is too harsh. There must have been people among the royal families in history who wanted to live a normal life without any interest in the battle for the throne. I remembered Yarina saying that. She vowed that once she became the empress, she would tear this system down first and fix it. I decided to follow her opinion. Even though it seemed like my efforts so far were going to be wasted, it was not true. It was because just with Yarina winning the battle for the throne, Ivan would die. After all, who in their sane mind will peacefully accept their death when they have the power to resist? Hero, are you really going to wait for death like this if a weak, muscle-less person like the third princess took over the empire? This empire would certainly be ridiculed by other kingdoms. The person who spoke those words was a certain count with a vast territory who fully supported the second princess. That's right, so far we have been competing, but now is the time to join forces. Let's protect the empire together, said a certain marquis who served as a faithful servant of the duke who supported the first princess. Let's do it together. Hero Duke Haven, who was the guardian of the first princess, gave up and decided to accept everything the moment the first princess lost the succession battle. Perhaps it was due to the fact that he's already old. The only one I can trust is you. The hero, the person who said that was a certain person who held onto both the first and the second, and was confused about which stance to take before the third princess won. The main character faces a crisis. The episode will change due to the probability. In a secret meeting with numerous nobles, Ivan closed his eyes. Then, after sorting out the thoughts in his mind, he opened it. Okay, have we been training our muscles just to let our empire be taken over by magic that doesn't make sense? Right. Ivan shouted and the nobles agreed. The hero flexed his muscles and his tendons bulged out. We don't have to wait long. Tonight, let's turn the empire upside down to save the princesses and the empire. Rebellion. Hero Ivan and the nobles were planning to rebel against the third princess, Yarina. It will be Yarina's first ordeal as the future empress, but unfortunately, as long as probability was behind the hero Ivan, Yarina would never be able to overcome it. So now it's my turn to work. I finally found my justification to kill Ivan. Until now, there was no reason for me to kill him. However, when he revolts against Princess Yarina, the rightful heir to the throne, the story would be different. Let's go, Arakeli, let's finish our work in this world. Accelerating time. It's a rebellion. You guys, do you think you will be safe after doing this, Kukha? A certain book described that the primal imperial castle in the evening looked as if the castle walls were burning like a bright gold flame as it reflected the brightness of the sun on its golden wall. However, it was no longer a simple description in this current situation, since the imperial castle had literally caught fire because of the wind of blood that brewed. The nobles who supported the first and second princesses did not recognize the victory of the third princess and eventually raised arms. Yarina was staying in her own palace when the rebellion broke out while the queen's guards came forward to stop the rebellion. However, the troops of the nobles were too strong. In due time, the rebellion will eventually be subdued, Yarina thought. She was certain of it since the troops of the nobles were nothing but a bunch of private soldiers who were thrown together. They could never overcome the elite forces of the imperial palace. But even if that's the case, would there be anyone to protect her until then? Although Yarina was the next empress, the current empress was still Primal Primalia. Until the succession was done, all of the troops were working for her, which means the only one who could protect her was herself. Yarina could hear a huge explosion from downstairs. It was the sound of someone ignorantly smashing the wall with their fist. If that person kept doing it, the castle would eventually collapse. He must have rushed to catch me. Even though she had no one to protect her, she had no intention of dying quietly. Yarina quickly ran to the top of the imperial castle. Normally, the princess who won the succession battle would move to the first imperial castle. If Yarina had been there, she would have been protected by the empress troops along with the empress. However, the rebellion occurred not long after the last trial of the succession battle ended, so she hadn't moved yet, meaning that they were aiming for her who would become the next empress. If things continue like this, I will die for sure. Yarina spurred as fast as she could and made her way to the highest floor. The imperial castle she was currently staying in was the 40 stories high 9th Imperial Castle. Even if the imperial troops arrived to protect Yarina, they would be blocked by the troops of the nobles who have taken over the castle. That's the third princess over there. Get her. If capturing is impossible, just kill her. Seeing the troops of the nobles chasing after her, Yarina bit her lips tightly. The wind blew violently as she slammed the rooftop door open. She didn't reduce her speed and sprinted towards the railings. Then she threw herself into the air with all her might. The rebel behind her belatedly swung their blades into the place she was seconds ago. The rebels clenched their teeth and looked at Yarina, who stood as she stepped into the air. She laughed as her hair fluttered freely, blown by the wind. You guys didn't bring a bow. Oh yeah, I forgot. You guys don't use ranged weapons because it's a weapon for cowards. Isn't it? Yarina bluffed as much as she could. Floating magic was a 5-circle spell. While using it, it was almost impossible to use any other spell. Though if she pushed her concentration to the limit, she would be able to cast some magic of 1 or 2 circles, albeit barely. But with only those spells, she knew that she could not inflict fatal blows to them. I can still bluff. She lit a flame in her hands. It was one of the only 3 spells she stored. When the magic of 4 circles, Pyxidium, was activated, the rebels faltered and retreated a bit. What is that? To use magic while flying. Yarina swung her hand with all her might, and when the fire hit the rooftop, flames exploded and ripped half of the rooftop. As the winds further spurned the flames more violently, the rooftop of the 9th Imperial Palace shone even brighter and burned even fiercer than any other Imperial Palace. Because of that, the sight of Yarina flying in the sky while using her magic could not only be seen by the rebels who arrived on the 40th floor, but also by most of the Imperial forces watching the sky from the ground. It's absurd. Did she hide this kind of power all this time? Hey, how can we fight her? She used magic while flying. The rebels faltered even more as they already witnessed the horror of Yarina's magic, a great magic which robbed the 2 princesses of their successor rights. Haha, Yarina could only laugh. After all, back in the 3rd trial, she was only able to cast those spells because she prepared for it. Meanwhile, currently she couldn't use a lot of spells while she was flying through the air. Now what should I do? Floating in the air, right? This was good and all. However, it consumed too much mana to move. It would be nice if she could go to the 0th Imperial Castle where the Empress resided, but it was simply impossible because she didn't have the required mana to do so. At that moment, what are you guys doing standing around like that? How are you supposed to catch a princess if you are just standing idly? The floor of the 9th Imperial Castle rooftop was torn off, and a person with a huge body appeared. It was the hero, Ivan Fedin. It's the hero. He has entered the war for us. Hupe. Ivan snorted his nose, dug his hand into the floor, ripped the ground off, and threw it at Yarina. Damn it, Yarina cursed as she cast one of the remaining 2 stored spells, namely Mana Shield. It was spread out in front of her to block the incoming brick. However, when the 2 clashed, the shield shook badly. Looking at Yarina, who couldn't retaliate, Ivan's lips twitched. Just managing to float in the air, doesn't it consume a lot of your mental strength? Unlike other warriors in the Empire, Ivan had a lot of experience in dueling against wizards while traveling to other continents. Among them, the floating spell was a spell which could only be used by wizards who had reached the highest level of magic. He was quite surprised when Yarina used it, but the fact that she would eventually die didn't change in Ivan's mind. Ivan tore the floor again. A huge boulder was lifted into Ivan's hands. At the sight, Yarina sharply bit her lips until it bled. She was frustrated. It was impossible for the shield to take Ivan's attack any longer. If this continues. The moment when such desperate thoughts passed by Yarina's thought, above Ivan's head, a man appeared and fell. Ivan lay flat on his stomach when the man who fell upon him, Autumn, quickly rolled sideways. Autumn staggered to get up and checked the clock floating in the air. Crazy, why did you accelerate so much? As I squeezed the last remaining probability in your body, it seems that the time went ahead a bit too much. It's not my fault though. You're saying that it's all my fault? Autumn looked around him and saw Yarina floating in the air. Her dress was ripped in several places and she was clearly not in a good shape. Her pretty braided hair had also been undone and hung loosely on her shoulder. Yarina pursed her mouth and grimaced in an attempt to suppress the feeling of something rushing in her heart. That expression makes you look ugly. Yarina realized her slip-up and hurriedly covered her face. At the same time, the floor shook because some muscly guy had just violently stood up. He then stared at Yu Autumn with eyes that resembled a wild beast. Yu Autumn also took out a white sword from his inventory and aimed it at the hero Ivan. Still, the way you look now suits you the best. As soon as he finished saying that to Yarina, Yu Autumn and Ivan ran towards each other. After only a brief exchange, the 40-story imperial castle completely collapsed. 15 minutes later, when the Empire's elite troops arrived, everything had already ended. Your Majesty, the leader of the rebellion, the former hero Ivan Fedon, was defeated by the third Princess Guardian, woodcutter Yu Autumn. The former hero was defeated by the woodcutter. Upon hearing the news, Empress Primel laughed for a long time. She really laughed for a long time. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like the video. Have a suggestion? Let me know in the comments.